We've got two people who have deep experience both in Bitcoin and in studying and thinking about the ways that authoritarian regimes exercise undue control on their populations. And so I guess at a high level, we've got 30 minutes for this panel. There are really three big things that I want to touch on with you two. The first is, how are tyrants using technology to strengthen their grip on power? Number two is, how are activists using Bitcoin to fight back? And number three is, why American policy matters for these international use cases of Bitcoin. So let's start first with you, Jorge, and then pass it to you, Roger. How are the modern dictatorships that we see today using technology to track, monitor, surveil their citizens and strengthen their grip on power?
Thank you, David. As you mentioned, I'm from Venezuela, and basically the people of my generation, the people that have 20-something years old, all of us, we are focused on trying to rebuild democracy and freedom in Venezuela. So when we do this, we start to analyze. We analyze with tools we are fighting against. We analyze what type of strategies are autocratic regimes using against us. And at the beginning, of course, I was focused more on communication strategies. I was focused more on ways to understand how they use corruption to advance their grip on power, diplomacy, all these things, sanctions evasion. But something that I started to realize is how they use technology, as you mentioned. They use technology in very efficient ways. And moreover, they used financial tools to attack human rights activists. Something that, for example, some of you may be aware is that in places like Venezuela, we cannot use traditional financial instruments, not only to operate our activism, but at the same time to live our life. Because they will use our bank accounts against us, they will weaponize our data, and they will find ways to attack us through our financial instruments. But something that people do not understand is that even if you are an activist in exile, you are also often attacked by authoritarian regimes based on your activism. How they do this? They do this through the international financial system. They use cooperation mechanisms from different financial institutions from different countries. They weaponize these instruments. They can collect the data of people. They can use propaganda so that you are deplatformed or debanked from financial institutions. So because of this experience, because I started to realize how this was used against activists who are friends of mine or who are members of my coalition, then I started to think about ways to address or to overcome these issues. And for me, this is the way I found Bitcoin. I'm not a developer. I'm not somebody that was in Bitcoin as an investment or as a speculation. For me, it was extremely simple. It was our way to continue our human rights operation. It was our way to provide financial inclusion to people. And this is something that, for example, I have talked to policymakers about. This is something that I'm talking also to activists so they understand how to use Bitcoin about it. And as somebody mentioned earlier this morning, the US has to be at the forefront of this technology. So that way this technology is used for good. So that way this technology is used for democracy promotion, to safeguard electoral processes, such as the case in Guatemala last year. And overall, to empower people. People, when they're in power, they can make changes. This is why autocratic regimes, they're trying to take everything away from us. They're trying to take away our freedom of speech. They're trying to take away our electoral rights. And something that they also try to take away is our financial rights. And I think through Bitcoin and again, other mechanisms, we can find ways to overcome this issue.
For sure. And thank you for sharing that perspective, your experience. Roger, you have studied China extensively. You've studied the way in which China is promoting a form of sort of digital authoritarianism, not only domestically, but sort of taking this sort of Huawei 5G sort of technology stack and exporting these technologies that surveil, monitor, track, censor people to other dictatorships. Like one of our fellows at BPI, Matt Pines calls it, authoritarianism as a service, right? Like a sort of play on the SaaS stuff. So could you speak a little bit on that first question? Like from your vantage point, and you can talk about China specifically or countries broadly, from your perspective, based on your work, how are you seeing tyrannical governments use technology to squash dissent?
Well, I think it started first with the global internet. China has maintained the Great Firewall for a very long time now and has been able to block free and open communications. Now what we're seeing, though, I think is a different degree, is that stack is getting more and more sophisticated. It starts to get into individualized financial control and access, and we are starting to see the consequences of that. For example, in Hong Kong, recently there was a law passed that essentially makes it illegal to support foreigners that could be violating the national security law. So there are several prominent exiles that are outside of Hong Kong now, but people actually have voiced fear and concerns. These are people who are outside of China, who are in the United States, who are in the United Kingdom, or somewhere else, nominally where they should be safe, but they express extreme concern. Some people who are in Hong Kong donating outwards, and some people who are in foreign jurisdictions, but may want to return to Hong Kong in the future, are expressing extreme concern about payment rails and just being able to pay and buy certain things. So I find that right now what we're seeing, I'm going to comment mostly from China, but I think China is trying to export this to the rest of the world. One thing I've researched a lot is the digital yuan, or the CBDC project that China is building. I have a lot of thoughts about that. The usage is not actually necessarily that high. But the point is that this stack is a new way to create control that goes beyond just communication, but also your finances. So if we're able to consolidate all these different data ledgers, right, the CBDC, or digital yuan, is actually something that allows you to actuate on that. Imagine if you, as a government, and it's very easy to paint a dystopian picture if this is a China, but this is also happening in Nigeria, this is also happening in other countries, can decide and look at someone's profile and say, you are no longer worthy of having bank reserves. We saw that with, the Navalny Foundation in Russia. We've seen that before I think it's happening in Iran right now, where there are bank accounts that are being seized for people who have violated the hijab law. I think the real big difference here is this is like a new scope of technology and technological control that governments may not have been designed for. In the American context, there's the Fourth Amendment. In other countries, that doesn't necessarily exist. And so when you combine the technological capabilities to do things, individualized interest rates, individualized penalties, and a government that has no constraints about deploying these things, you start to see the beginning of a very aggressive techno-nationalist stack that I believe China is trying to export around the world.
And so a follow-up question for you, Roger. In what ways, if any, have you seen activists, dissenters in China using either Bitcoin or sort of related technologies?
Yeah, I scoured it long and hard. I think in Hong Kong there were some instances during the protest where some of the Bitcoin businesses supported the protesters. There definitely was indications. There are non-for-profits now that are associated with Hong Kong that are now training on their usage of Bitcoin. I think what we saw in Hong Kong specifically, the fact that people were denied bank account access, their bank accounts were frozen for running a nomination process, right, is something that will become more and more common as governments have more and more of this ability. So that I haven't seen I didn't see a ton of active usage of Bitcoin. It's not like people are running around using Lightning to transact payments with each other on the ground in Hong Kong. In fact, Bitcoin ATM usage decreased because, it was kind of naive of me because I was going and I was looking for all these sources and I'm like, I wonder if Bitcoin ATM usage is up, and the people are like, well, no, there's these massive protests, so no one can go outside to access the ATM. So that was kind of a counter to the thesis that I was trying to make there. But there are these, I would say two things. One is that Bitcoin itself is a hedge against China's philosophy of financial control. I think this is very important. The fact that so much interest in Bitcoin is driven by Chinese people, whether that is, we see this with BRC20 and runes now, we saw this with Bitcoin before. I think that's a really important point that people miss. It is very much an expression of the Chinese people and their willingness, despite there being a round of bans, whether that's the mining bans or the exchange bans, to still transact outside of the financial controls and privacy the Chinese Communist Party is trying to impose. And so what I think people may sometimes miss about that is like actually degrading the system. And the Chinese Communist Party recognized this very early. It was one of the first states in 2014 to recognize a digital currency initiative for exactly this reason. Because it has always been at the forefront of understanding that control of money and control of communications is control of people. So I would say that like people buying Bitcoin, there's been a ton of interest in China from Tether and everything else. People selling and buying Tether is more of a dissenting act than people realize. And the Chinese authorities will arrest one person every 12 months for even the simple act of selling Tether. It happens every once in a while, just as like a reminder that it's something that's frowned upon. But because of the currency restrictions, because of the financial restrictions that are imposed on the Chinese people, there is a demand, and you see this now, especially the Chinese economy is not doing that well, to get out of the system. So that's first. And then second, I mean, there's the more obvious cases of dissent. I've seen, for example, on Nostra, there are people who are using, Nostra is kind of like a decentralized relay system. One of the points I tried to make is that Nostra is one of the only places where the Chinese internet and the American or Western internet are actually talking to each other, but people don't realize.
Wait, can you, for the audience, explain what you mean by this relay? I don't know if everyone here is familiar with Nostra.
Okay, well, just in short, I don't want to give like a technical explanation of the whole system, but Nostra allows you to, in theory, run your own hardware similar to Bitcoin that allows you to decide what communications you want to broadcast or receive from different people around the world. So it works very similarly, but almost think about it as like Bitcoin, but for communications.
So would it be fair to say that with Nostra, like dissidents in China can communicate, organize, spread information without at least the sort of direct censorship that we would see on the regular internet?
Yes and no. The Chinese state has tried to go against Nostra. I actually talked to the creator of Damus, which is one of the main clients to access Nostra through iOS. The Chinese party state, on the first day it was released, or the second day, asked for Apple to take it down in the App Store. This, by the way, is a very common thing, American companies being co-opted by the Chinese party state. I believe Apple has the highest record of like state requests for taking down apps is China, which makes sense given their line of business. Nostra allows you to, in theory, run a relay yourself. We don't know how many people are doing this, but what I can say is that people in China are using Nostra, are broadcasting things to the network, and they're broadcasting things that the Chinese party state probably would not like. There is a Wuhan journalist, Zhang Zhen, who was arrested, I would say arbitrarily, based off her reporting whistleblowing in Wuhan. And there were people who were reposting her quotes, like on Nostra. And I think that that's like much more important than people realize, because there is actually not really, I was part of Clubhouse, that was, I think it's in my bio or something, but that was actually a much bigger deal than what people realize, because that was like, the Chinese party state is always saying we need people-to-people dialogue. That's the only time in my lifetime I've experienced Chinese people talking with Americans in like real time, like peer-to-peer.
Wow.
And Nostra, I think, is the only place where that exists now.
Wow. So we've got, about halfway through here. Jorge, I want to ask you, two questions. I'll start with one. You sort of alluded broadly to this idea of, having your bank accounts frozen, your bank accounts seized. But I want to sort of drive this point home with specifics. So if possible, can you share with the audience maybe sort of the sort of one or two kind of key examples of either you and your colleagues using Bitcoin or other people that you've maybe worked with in the past using Bitcoin, either in Venezuela or elsewhere?
Yes, and you want to understand the specifics of also how people are debanked and the platform.
Yeah.
Right? So basically, in cases when you are inside an authoritarian country, it's of course very straightforward process. All financial institutions are actually connected with the regime. So in the case if you're an activist, then the regime will either close your bank account directly, or they can of course extract your data. And this of course happens with hundreds, thousands of activists in authoritarian regimes. I think the most interesting question is in regards to activists in exile. How are the mechanisms for authoritarian regimes to actually take away the financial access of these activists? If you're an activist in exile and you have a bank account, let's say in Europe, or you have a bank account in the US, as any client, you need to comply with a series of background check to say. It's something called Know Your Customer regulations, which basically says that banks have to check where you come from, what do you work, if you have any criminal records, etc. This is, of course, made with well intentions, because banks and financial institutions, they have to know who are their clients. But what happens is, if you are a human rights activist escaping an autocratic regime, what happens if you have tons or numerous amount of propaganda against you or disinformation against you, telling you that you are a potential threat to your state, or telling you that you are a criminal, or telling you that you are involved in any kind of illicit activities? Then by default, banks will not be able or don't want to have you as a client, because your risk profile increases to the point in which you are not profitable. This happens with hundreds of thousands of political activists. This morning, we heard stories from at least 3 political activists from different countries, from Ukraine, from Russia, and from Nicaragua, that do not have bank accounts. Because again, the risk profile increases to the point in which it's not profitable for banks. Because it's not just one background check. Regimes, they're able to create propaganda constantly. They have hundreds of media outlets in which they can spread misinformation. So that's one thing. The second thing is that banks have ways to talk to each other. Banks have ways to send signals to each other. These, for example, financial institutions in Venezuela can send signals to financial institutions in Europe or in the US. They can also request information. This is something called the travel rule in the financial system. And all this, again, is done with well intentions. These, of course, are mechanisms created by the G7 countries to actually increase transparency. But the reality is what they create is a system in which human rights activists are being attacked. So these are cases of direct financial exclusion. There is also cases of indirect financial exclusion. Let's say that, for example, you are an immigrant from a country like Venezuela, which is a sanctioned state. It's a state that has been labeled by the Treasury and the Justice Department of the US as a state with links with drug trafficking and with even terrorism. So if you're a person from a country like Venezuela, or even a person from a country like Colombia, then your risk profile as a client automatically spikes to the point in which many people find tremendous difficulties to open bank accounts. This happens to not only immigrants without any kind of legal status. This happens with immigrants with residency. This happens with immigrants with job offers, and even with dual nationalities, for example, in the EU. So what happens is that then these laws, who are intended to tackle financial crime, actually end up harming millions of people. And the worst thing, they do not tackle financial crime effectively. So this is also something that we have been talking to policymakers and to regulators. In the case of Europe, for example, we initiate a resolution proposal to guarantee a right to banking to all people. So that way immigrants are safeguarded and protected. So that way we have provisions, a specific provision on all these regulations to protect immigrants from these countries. And at the same time, we also need to protect activists. From a regulatory perspective and from a new technology perspective, I believe that Bitcoin is the way that we can mitigate these issues.
Thank you. So as we close this panel down, I mean, I think the obvious remaining question is, why does this matter in the context of a conference focused on, U.S. public policy? Maybe a more pointed way to ask this question is, what does the global human rights community stand to lose if America does not get digital asset regulation correct? Like, for example, there are laws that are being proposed now. DAML is a great example that, if passed in their current form, would effectively ban the at least sort of sovereign use of digital assets by Americans. But we're talking about people who aren't in America. So, Roger, let's start with you, and then Jorge. Why is it so important that America has digital asset policies that don't ban crypto, basically?
Well, I think there's kind of like one, which would be more of the activist route, is that the United States still sets the example for a lot of different countries. The obvious thing is that, other states, authoritarian states, will use America's example as a whataboutism thing, which is a typical kind of response. So, for example, a lot of the policy that China has enforced on Xinjiang they actually use as their justification the fact that the war on terror was like kind of conducted in a certain way. So I think that there is that, but I also think that if the United States gets it wrong, there's a more subtle argument here where the technology stack that will win out will likely be the techno-authoritarian stack, meaning that countries that don't see a lot of exemplars of people getting the balance right on Bitcoin are going to likely adopt some version of central bank digital currencies. And that goes across ideological lines. Like you see India piloting it. You see, even though India is a stark, oftentimes rival to China geopolitically, they are looking at the model because it is appealing to a lot of states to have this idea of monetary supremacy, monetary control, and rights. And so I think if countries like the United States that are trying to offer a balanced path don't get it right, that lends itself to a world that leans more towards states who are currently looking through these pilot statuses and everything else towards that direction. And the last thing I'm going to say, which is not actually really the activist route, but it's just a thought that occurred because there's a lot of like great power competition dynamics and policy and everything in this, and something I've been trying to think about for a while. Bitcoin mining is a gift that China gave to the US. This is actually like exactly the opposite of how most economic trends have happened. So if you think about it, in the last 30 years, there's like this like wellspring of regret over like, we used to have shipbuilding capacity. We used to have semiconductor manufacturing capacity. Texas Instruments was built here. All of the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation companies got their training with Texas Instruments, Morris, everyone. And it moved to Taiwan, it moved to China. And with Bitcoin mining, there's like just such a unique opportunity because China, it was so like opposed to it ideologically that it decided to like throw the bath out with the bathwater. China still has the problem of stranded power. They still have hydroelectricity dams because Mao loved them or whatever in different provinces. They have chosen to foreclose that problem. They've chosen to force the provinces to ban Bitcoin mining. That is just a straight gift to the United States, or any country actually, rather, but in the United States in particular, to actually gain back some of the monetary incentives to rebuild the capacity to manage physical spaces, heat, and compute power. So just like a point I would make on that in terms of the United States getting that element right.
Thank you, Roger. And Jorge, to close us out, the same question to you. Why, from the perspective of the global human rights community, is American public policy for Bitcoin so important?
First of all, the United States has always been at the forefront of supporting people like us, human rights activists from countries like Venezuela. The US is doing this also because the US flourishes in a free world. We need to have a world in which we have democracies. Democracies don't have wars against themselves. And we live in this geopolitical paradigm in which you have authoritarian countries on the march, moving forward. So we need to find ways to stop this. The way I think, and I think the correct premise of this technology is that Bitcoin is a force for good. If we believe in this premise, and if we believe that Bitcoin is an empowering factor for activists in difficult places, then the US has to be also the forefront of promoting this technology. The United States, what they do, what they regulate, the way they approach technologies also have spillover effects to other countries. The way the United States will, for example, approach regulation of Bitcoin and other new technologies will affect the way Europe will regulate it, will affect the way virtually every country does that. So the United States, by its geopolitical position, by its soft power, by its influence, will determine the way the world regulates, approaches, and internalizes this technology. What we have to do, and what I believe we need to do, is to bring together policymakers in the US and people that use Bitcoin in authoritarian contexts. We need to work together so that way we develop an effective mechanism and an effective policies for Bitcoin. And I do believe that we have a lot to learn from this. We have a lot to win from this because right now we are living, and I'm not overreacting, in a period of complete change in the international sphere. You have countries like China, you have countries like Russia, you have countries like Iran, like Venezuela. They believe they can win. They believe that they can destroy the free world. They believe that the system of governance is the future. So if we don't take advantage of these new technologies, if we don't actually fight this fight, and I really believe that we will be in trouble. So we need to come together, we need to support people who use Bitcoin. And not only this, I think we need to be open to new ways to find authoritarianism. Because in the past generation, the trend is towards less freedom. The trend is towards less effectiveness in how to transition from autocracies to democracies. When was the last time that a dictatorship failed? When was the last time that we had revolutions or that we have a spirit of the one that we had in the 1990s? So I think we need to rethink the way we see democracy promotion, and the first way to do it is to see these new technologies.
Okay, so as we wind things down, I guess to recap what we've learned here, we've learned principally that the reliance on the state to transact is a massive liability for dissidents and activists in authoritarian regimes. We've learned that having a bank account and being an activist means that pretty soon, if you're in an authoritarian regime, you won't be able to spend money anymore. We've learned that across the world, both from in this panel and as you pointed out earlier this morning, that there are real, tangible, not hypothetical use cases and examples of activists using Bitcoin to circumvent the authority of dictators. Next, we learned on this panel that American public policy is critical to the end of global human rights activism. And I think those sort of three, I guess, sort of reasons that you guys talked about, I think, are worth repeating. One being that America loses its ability to name and shame tyrants if their financial restrictions are just as draconian as ours. We also learned from you, Roger, that the choice is not Bitcoin or nothing. That sort of aspiring tyrants all across the world are being courted by the Chinese government to adopt a techno-authoritarian surveillance stack, and that sort of Bitcoin, as it just exists, can sort of at least fill that gap and offer these countries an alternative in a way that the diminished sort of development of Bitcoin in the United States could undermine. And yeah, we've finally learned that there's sort of more at stake here than just activists. That if America fails to create a legal environment where Bitcoin and private Bitcoin usage flourishes, that net freedom, civil liberties decline, and it becomes harder for liberal democracies to resist the drift toward dictatorship. So I hope, those are my takeaways from this panel at least. I hope you guys took something similar away. And I want to thank both of you for traveling, in your case, pretty far to get here. So thank you.
Thanks to you.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for having us.